Hello, and thank you all for joining us for a discussion on crafting hiring processes that reduce bias and create consistency. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Carrot. Today's webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the hiring channel. So let's get started with some introductions. My name is Jason Wong. I am a leadership coach, fractional VP of engineering, and DEI practitioner with over 20 years of experience in the tech industry. And today, I have the honor of being your panel moderator. Speaking of our panel, first up, we have Jared Jordan. Jared has been leading engineering teams for nearly 10 years. Jared is currently driving new member growth for Netflix in the APAC region, where his core responsibilities include managing feature development and building an inclusive, high-performance team for Netflix. In addition to his day job, Jared has gotten involved in driving diversity efforts in engineering organizations and, as a result, has helped reshape the company's efforts in inclusivity. Prior to Netflix, Jared ran Evernote's growth engineering and commerce platform organization. He has also successfully managed teams and led innovative dev programs at various Silicon Valley giants. At Ericsson, he launched cloud-based TV apps for mobile devices. At Microsoft, he helped the company with MSN Mobile and Bing Mobile. He also worked on SkyDrive, the Windows 8 modern file explorer. And at Motorola, he worked on the development of PPL, Razor 2, and Sidekick software for mobile devices. Jared's not just a software tinkerer and large-scale problem solver, he's also a husband and father of 3, an avid follower of Christ, and craft beer connoisseur. And on top of all of it, he's a member of DevColor's A-Star program, where he empowers fellow Black software engineers to help them achieve their goals. Next up, we have Lori Barth. Lori is a staff engineer at Gatsby who develops content in her spare time. She's passionate about hiring practices in the industry and has written quite a bit on the subject, including as a contributor to the Holloway Guide. When she isn't writing code, you can find her playing Among Us and hanging out with her puppy, Abbott. Our third panelist is Chamail Turner. Chamail is an engineering manager at Stripe, working to build the economic infrastructure of the internet. Prior to Stripe, Chamail has held engineering leadership roles at companies such as F5 Networks and Nintendo, and technical and marketing leadership roles at Critical Mass and Volkswagen. He has a passion for developing technology leaders at all levels and is determined to hear underrepresented voices amplified in our industry. And last but not least, our fourth panelist today is Shannon Hogue Brown. Shannon Hogue Brown started her career writing software over 20 years ago and has moved through the ranks as an engineer and ultimately CTO. She's passionate about improving developer productivity so that dreams and innovations can be built. As head of solutions engineering at Carrot, Shannon works closely with engineering teams to understand their hiring bars, align interviews to them, and create more predictive hiring processes. She lives in San Francisco with her 2 dogs, Seamus and Locke, and I think perhaps a cat as well might make a cameo today. Is that right? Great. All right. Well, again, thank you all for joining us around the world. Before we get going, I just wanted to remind everyone that this, as long as with all DEI-related discussions, the goal here is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Being a DEI practitioner means constantly challenging ourselves by being curious, doing our own work, and keeping our focus on the larger goal. To paraphrase Austin Channing Brown, this work is about becoming a better human to other humans. So on that note, let's dive in. Today's session is all about crafting hiring processes that reduce bias. So I thought we'd just start from the top and talk about candidate pools. So Chamail, what should our candidate pools look like?
Yeah, thanks for the question and good morning, everyone. I have a very US-centric initial response, and then I want to challenge myself to be a bit uncomfortable and a bit vulnerable and go a little deeper. When I think about candidate pools, I think about our users, and I want the candidates that are coming to become potential employees at Stripe to look like the user base that we have, and that user base is in fact global. And so typically when thinking about this problem, the response might be, well, 13% of the US is Black, and you go down sort of the race and create and the percentage of representation from a population perspective and say, oh, okay, so my internal culture and my internal employee pool should look somewhat reflective of that. But if you scale your organization or your business and you are then looking at a global talent pool, I think you do have to challenge yourself to consider, well, what does that actually mean about the top level funnel and the number of folks, the type of folks that I'm trying to attract and bring in as potential employees? And so if I'm, for instance, working in Singapore, there are 4 primary representative nationalities there that I would want to look into. And in fact, the government requires that if you're going to hire folks in Singapore, that you hire a certain percentage from those 4 pools. And if you're in Japan, looking at historically underrepresented voices, such as those that might be Korean or mainland Chinese, would be something that you could, again, challenge yourself with to say, am I truly reflective of what I intend to represent internally by the users, by the customers, by the folks who are experiencing my products and services externally? You also have to be somewhat culturally aware, because though, again, I can speak with some level of privilege being in the US and saying that I can challenge some of those norms, I do know and am aware that it's a bit more difficult in other locales. So I would say that ultimately you want to be reflective of what you want or aspire to be as an organization internally and externally. If you can't, then you want to at least make an attempt to have a conversation as to why you can't. Understand the data, understand the restrictions, understand the constraints, and solve, thereby hopefully getting to more reasonable outcomes for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I mean, I think, that understanding of context, right? And like our U.S. context versus sort of an international context is super interesting. For folks who are looking to sort of diversify the candidate pool, like what are some ways that you've been successful in doing that?
For
Jamil, yeah.
for us, I think the thing that we challenged ourselves with, and I speak most, I think, expertly with the organization I'm currently with, but at other organizations I've seen similarly shaped actions where we really challenge ourselves to look at the top of the funnel, look at the folks that
Mhm.
are applying and what systems, and I'm going to go ahead and just say it up front. I'm going to talk a lot about systems today because I think that that's one of the real issues that we tend to ignore. We're operating in systems that self-perpetuate, and those systems self-perpetuating mean that even if we make nuanced changes, even if we make large deliberate changes, we're still working within the constraints of those systems. And so what does that mean in reality? It means that if you're saying, well, I want to get more historically underrepresented groups into my organization, well, that's all fine and good, but what happens once they get there? Are you supporting their growth? Are you making sure that they're going to be successful? Are you looking at your regretted and non-regretted attrition rates and understanding why people are leaving, if they're leaving? And so I think, Jason, the short answer, there is no short answer to your question, is
Yeah.
you really have to be, as we all as engineers are, data driven and understand what's happening and use the right word. Context is so critically important. Understanding the nuance of the domain in which you're operating in and the constraints that you have so that you can challenge those constraints and then hopefully challenge the system.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that I talk to people often about is like, we need to build systems to counter the system, right? We can't, like you're saying, like these ad hoc or these one, like there is no Super Bowl. There's no like one tweak here, one tweak there. It's a whole entity, not just from the recruiting, but on through the life of that candidate at your company, which is, I think, really great. Cool. Lori, I think part of attracting different candidates is sort of understanding how our job descriptions affect that candidate pool mix. Like, what are some tips that you can give folks to help ensure that they're not inadvertently limiting themselves?
Yeah, so we've actually been lucky in this industry in the past, I want to say 2 to 3 years, where this concept has become a lot more mainstream and people are a lot more aware of it. And they've actually built tools to help you with the actual language that you're you're using in your job descriptions. So the one I'm familiar with is Textio. I know there are others, but it's sort of like a parser that will go through and say, hey, using this term is probably going to limit the number of women who apply, or using this term is probably going to make your candidate pool significantly younger or much more American, or that sort of thing, which is really useful because you can go sort of at the root cause of individual word choice. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is different people have different reasons for wanting to take a job, and they're not all the same. Some people highly index on the technology you're using. Some people highly index on, the name of the company. Other people really care about having beer in the office is sort of the joke, but then there's a whole nother set of people who care about having flexibility to pick up their kids at the end of the day. And that's where things get more challenging. We tend to over-index, depending on what type of employees we currently have, on motivations and trying to sort of guess what people are going to, what's going to attract people to a given job. And we double down on that with the language that we use. And so I think one of the first things we can do is sort of try and give as much information as possible. What type of culture is this? What type of technology will you be using? What type of benefits do we offer? What is, our remote culture like, or our in-office culture like, which is especially important right now. And if the more information we give, the more signifiers that gives to a wide variety of people who can find what motivations they're looking for, instead of leaving out that information, because it's often the absence of that information that causes people who have different motivations to feel like they won't fit in that company. Because if you're only talking about, Y Combinator founders, and you never mention that you have a flexible work from home policy, they're going to make assumptions in the absence of that information. So part of it is language, but part of it is making sure that the language is focused on all of the different reasons that someone might be attracted to, interested, or find a right fit with a job or a company.
Yeah, that's great. The absence of information. One of the things that I run into a lot when I'm helping folks hire is we do this work of creating a hiring plan, and we talk about what does the shape of this candidate look like? And we end up with pages, pages of what this candidate should look like. And then I have to do the work of does this person even exist? What are your thoughts, Lori, about how you capture that in job descriptions?
Yeah. So I think the biggest mistake we make sort of across the board in job descriptions is that we put the kitchen sink in there and we go for everything that we would like this person to be able to do day one because we have a need in our company. That's why we're hiring in the first place. And no one is going to hit the ground running on day one, even if they have absolutely everything on your wish list. They came from a different structure, different organization. They're going to need to learn your code base. They're going to have to figure out what your processes and systems are. So there's a ramp up for everyone. And when we accept that, it becomes a lot easier to not throw the kitchen sink at job descriptions, because when we do that, we're limiting a lot of the people who are going to apply because they're going to say, that whole thing about I meet 60% of the requirements versus 100% of the requirements. But when we throw the kitchen sink at stuff, we also don't weight things properly. So if you list 10 skills and you care the most about 2 of them, and you get a candidate who has 8 of the others, why are you hiring the second candidate? You should be hiring the first one because that's the stuff you care about more. So if you can go through that laundry list of stuff that you'd ideally like the candidate to have and point out what is most critical, what you think they have to know ahead of time versus what they can learn, and then level appropriately instead of just saying, hey, senior would be great because they're not going to have any ramp up. If you can get all of those things right, then you can be a lot more nuanced in the way you write things. You can say, hey, it's really, really important that you know Python because we need someone who's a language expert in Python. But if you've never worked with, some build tool before, but you're interested in it or you're willing to learn it, that's the type of language you want to use in that case. If you can start signifying the things that truly matter and you really need someone to come with domain knowledge in, compared to the things that you would like them to learn or be interested in or have some familiarity with. Maybe they've, played around with it in their free time, or, they've seen it in use, but they haven't actually built anything. Then you can get a little more detailed about what you really are looking for. And then you're not going to have this problem of like, it's 20 pages long. And also leave some things out, right? Like if you don't, just because someone has to learn it eventually, or the previous person who did the job took this task, you're not going to get a 1-for-1 replacement for the person who left or for the hole that you have in your company. See what you can piece together. I was watching Moneyball the other night, if anyone's ever seen that movie, and it's like, how are we going to replace Johnny Damon? Well, you can't replace Johnny Damon. You need to have 5 different players that we can afford that are going to add up to the runs and on-base percentage that Johnny Damon had. So if we could take that kind of a perspective when we start putting together what we're actually looking for, what holes we're trying to replace, we're not going to get 20 pages. We're going to get something that has some nuance to it, some possibilities of different types of people who might fit into that hole.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like the way I think about it is just like our candidates aren't immutable, like our organizations and the people inside them are also not immutable. Like we're plastic and we adapt to things that we introduce in the system, and we can have faith in that adaptation ability. Great, thank you. All right, so like that's our sort of candidate pool. Now we sort of get to like the actual interview. Like, so Shannon, when it comes to setting up interviews, that's like your specialty, right? And something that's tried and true is the structured interview. And I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with it. So like for our audience out there, could you help sort of define what a structured interview are, and what are some of your pointers in setting up a structured interview?
Yeah, and we've done now over 80,000 of these with some of the top tech companies. So I'm really excited to talk about this. It's really important, especially when it comes to diversity in technology, and it means a lot to me personally. Structured interviewing is essentially using the same rubric and methodology and for interviewing to assess candidates that are applying for the same position in your company. So that's the very high level, but the practical way to do this, there are a few techniques that we suggest from the Carrot side. So the first most important thing is, again, having a structured scoring rubric, okay? It's the best first thing that you can do to start not just creating a fair and predictive and enjoyable environment for all of your candidates, but also to start improving your hiring signal. And so working off of some of those competencies that you put in that job description that Lori was speaking about. In order to have consistency in the process, it requires a structure that forces your recruiters and your interviewers to make observations rather than judgments, right? So if you, for example, say, hey, here are the competencies that we would like to interview for, this is exactly what we plan on asking the candidates based on the competencies that each one of our interviewers are going to be looking at, even just having them check a box to confirm that a candidate produced a fully working solution during a paired coding interview sends a clear and measurable hiring signal that's easy to compare across all of the candidates. Again, making that a fair and predictive environment. Structured rubrics also help interviewers and hiring managers by making it clear which competencies matter, which is also what you and I think Lori were getting to. And it does that by creating an objective scale to assess those competencies. And in fact, one of the folks that we actually work with quite often, he's a senior leader at Salesforce, and he's amazing. He's someone that I would consider a mentor. He says that actually when you're building out that structured rubric, think about the competencies that you build out for your leveling within your organization, and then translate that into your job descriptions and your interview process from a competency perspective. And I think that works very well for folks. But again, I think the most important thing is create that structured rubric, define the competencies beforehand, make sure that it's a repeatable process. And again, the act of filling out that structured rubric is going to force your interviewers to objectively confront their biases in each evaluation, because it's backed by rigorous definition that you can then audit and defend.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that also sort of points to what Shamil is saying. It's like, it's a system, right? And it's not just at the interview process, but it's also this career ladder of how we're going to be evaluating you while you're, and rewarding what behaviors we reward and what behaviors we're going to punish. like speaking of like rubrics, I think one place where folks struggle, Shannon, is like the culture fit / values interview. And how do we be like, how do you create a rubric for that? Like, how do we think about that as a place where I think a lot of bias does creep in that section?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't necessarily think that you can build a rubric around culture fit, but what you can do is start to be more objective in your hiring processes, right? And so if you have more diverse panel of folks that are doing the interviewing, then it's more likely that that more diverse panel of folks will notice if there's something amiss throughout the process when it comes to culture fit. I don't often see that folks have a separate culture fit interview. What you see is that you have different developers that are interviewing for different competencies, and then they'll give feedback as to whether or not a person is a culture fit. And so there's a few ways to combat that. First is please don't hire people with bias. If you allow bias in your teams, it's going to be, it's kind of going to propagate. And so just make sure that you're careful. But also what you can do as an organization is start to actually measure each point in the interview process. So, and see what those drop-off points are. And if what you're seeing is that more diverse candidates coming through tend to drop off at a single person in your organization, maybe you have to have more difficult conversations. But again, setting up a structured rubric and having defensible feedback on a candidate and noticing whether or not that culture, then what it's doing is it's making sure that that culture fit really truly is the only thing that you're taking a look at. And it means that the data that you're getting from whether or not it's a diverse team, it means that you can apply that more specifically and say, okay, I'm seeing that women and people of color aren't a culture fit more often, even though we're checking all the boxes on the competencies and they meet our hiring bar, right? So just having a structured hiring bar and having that structured rubric will enable you to do that. And again, making sure that you measure at each round in the process and see if you have any drop-off points are important. And then the third piece, again, is going to be making sure that that panel of folks who are talking about a candidate are actually diverse. If you have a culture where women are constantly being talked over, people of color aren't speaking up because that's kind of what you've built inside the organization, that tends to happen in that panel, and you're going to end up with less diverse candidates there. So.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Here's an interesting one, Jared. So a friend of mine recently asked me about hiring. They had been advised, like in order to meet their sort of diversity goals, that they should start considering hiring based on potential. So like, for instance, one of their screening criteria was, has this person written an iOS app, right? And it came up that that criteria might be biasing against folks who either like don't have the time to work on side projects or don't have that privilege of learning software engineering on a computer they could easily afford. So what advice would you give to hiring managers about how do they think about hiring as it relates to potential?
That's a good question. The first thing I think is we all, as engineering leaders, hire on potential. We don't know that the person can come in and do their job. So that's kind of a skill that we all have. I think a lot of what Jamel and Lori and Shannon have already said is like, you need to understand the context of the people that you're hiring. So what kind of environment are they coming into? So if you have a bunch of senior leaders that are able to help build that person up, then you will have probably a successful track record for that person where you can bring in a candidate that has not all of the skills that are required to do the job, but you have some fits that you need and they can learn more skills as they ramp up. Then you have a successful experience for that candidate. However, if you have your team structure or organizational structure is not set up for that candidate to be able to learn from other engineers or learn from other people around them, and there's not a strong mentorship and understanding, then you're not going to be able to bring a candidate that doesn't have that expectation of learning on the job. And that may not be a successful experience for transitioning for the first 3 to 6 to 9 months. So you have to have that capacity in your organization to absorb that individual and then be able to ramp them up. And so when I think about the hiring for potential, I think about it is how do you set this person up in the interview cycle so that you can measure that potential. And then once they get there and on board, how do they become transition to being a successful candidate?
Great. Yeah, that's good. Something that struck me there is like, we all hire based on potential of some sort, right? It reminds me of this study about sort of financial stock analysts and it was like a study on knowledge portability. And so they would take like these like high performing stock analysts from one company and bring them over to another company. And it turns out like when that happens, they underperform for like up to 5 years. And like, so that this idea that we have of knowledge workers being able to just up and go and be successful in other places is like completely false. And like, I remember that really influences how I think about, it's not just about the candidate, it's how we as a team are helping to support this person's success. That's awesome. Thank you. Tremail, so that sort of brings us a little bit to this concept of identity blind versus identity aware hiring. So like an example of identity blind recruiting is like removing names from resumes or anonymizing homework submissions. Whereas like identity aware is sort of understanding how someone's identity might impact or affect their application. So for instance, they might have shorter stints at jobs, or maybe they don't have a very active GitHub profile. Like, how do you think about identity blind versus identity aware as it relates to the recruiting process?
Yeah, for everybody watching, I have a simple question. Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? And as you hear that and you think about that, know that that's actually a study that was run by the University of Chicago back in 2002. And what Bertrand and her colleagues found was that it was more than, I think, 50% more likely that Emily and Greg, who have traditionally white sounding names, at least here in the US, were getting callbacks on resume submissions that were exactly the same as Lakeisha and Jamal. And reading that study and thinking about, well, that was almost 18 years ago, it probably is still pretty true today. And that's a real sad state of affairs when you think about the systems that perpetuate that type of bias. Shannon talked about this, and I really love what she said about when you're thinking about your rubrics and the hiring process that you build, enveloping that in as much, well, trying to remove as much bias as you possibly can. Any system that has humans involved is going to have bias no matter how hard you try. It's either going to be conscious and deliberate, or it's going to be unconscious. You're not going to know that you're doing it. It's just learned behavior. It's lived experience. It's what you've been exposed to in the media. It's what you think you know, but you've never actually had the opportunity to have a conversation and challenge yourself about some of those presumptions. And so this is why I like talking about systems, because this perpetual cycle of racism, sexism, you name the ism, it gets in there. And it becomes part of our collective consciousness, and it becomes part of the way that we operate and comport ourselves when we have these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to your question, Jason, I think that tactics like doing identity blind submissions, they're great, but they're treating the symptom. They're not attacking the virus, apropos of this moment in time that we're all living in. And I think the big opportunity for all of us, those of us that have the agency and have the ability to do so, is to challenge that system, to understand, why do those biases exist in the first place? Like, why are we more likely to look at a African-American candidate who has the exact same credentials as an Asian, East Asian, or South Asian, or white candidate, and then the percentage outcome, it's more likely that those latter three are going to get the role as opposed to that African-American candidate? Why is it that when we talk about the bar, we are reticent to define what exactly the bar is? We just talk about the bar, a place you go get drinks or you pass in order to become an attorney. In tech, it's this ephemeral thing that means, oh, here's a proxy for whether or not I believe you should be a part of my organization, whether you're a culture fit or if you have the technical skill and ability to keep up with us. What does that even mean? Have those conversations and be able to challenge what your assumptions and presumptions may be. I do like that notion of being identity aware and understanding the context that the person comes from. I'm a Black guy that was born in the city of Detroit, been in the news recently now because of some interesting things that were happening in Wayne County. I don't sound like I'm from Detroit. That's because I'm code switching right now. I'm talking in the manner that is comfortable for all of you listening. If I were to talk like I spoke when I was growing up, you might have questions about whether or not I was qualified to be on this panel right now. And that's a real conversation that we could have. Why would you have that discomfort? I think at the end of the day, what we really need to do as leaders in this industry is to challenge why our industry exists in the manner that it does today. What are the systems? What are the structures? What are the things that we perpetuate? Me being a part of that, by the way, I'm implicating myself in this because I am a part of it. Why is it the way that it is? And what can we invest in to change it? That's the real challenge for all of us as leaders.
Wow, for sure. It's funny. People in my line of work, they come to me and they ask me, like, they almost always come with a diversity first approach. Like, I need to hire more engineers of color. I need to hire more women engineers. And it is like that. It is that awkward conversation of having to unwind and say, wait a minute, like, that's not what we need to be talking about. Actually, what we need to do is like build up the skills and fluency of equity and inclusion so that we have a good substrate and foundation upon which we can start thinking about diversifying our engineering organizations and making them welcoming places where people can thrive. I think that sort of, it's weird how as engineers we deal with complex distributed systems all the time, but when it comes to systems of humans, like, there's this like weird mind block of like, wait, no, that can't be. Wow. Anyways, sorry, just voicing that. Interesting. So I guess here's a question, Jamil. Like, where would you start in terms of like building your system? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I tease, so I'm in this environment that is, it's very interesting. It's intellectually rigorous. I love the people that I work with. I'm hopeful that some of them are watching so that I can get some kudos and slack later. But it's true that I profess my love for the team readily because it's one of the most dynamic, diverse of thought, at least, an interesting group of folks that I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And what I love to say about them is that, hey, this great collection of nerds that I get to work with, myself included, we can't math our way out of these problems. It's a thing where we tend to want to focus on the data a lot. And I mentioned data earlier in one of my earlier responses as well. And we want to sort of look at percentages and look to see if a dial is monotonically increasing or monotonically decreasing, and challenge ourselves with OKRs and saying that a 70% solution is better than, if we had not considered any solution whatsoever. But we don't have the real conversation. And I think part of changing and challenging the system is to have the real conversation. And that is, okay, is this a racist country? That's really uncomfortable. And that's a really challenging thing to have in a business context. But if you're going to do something that has outsized impact, you've got to have conversations that are, to your earlier point, Jason, extremely uncomfortable. And you've got to be in an environment that's supportive of having those conversations. I think once you start having the conversation and you start to, if we can steal from, I think, verbiage and vernacular that our industry loves applying, maybe sometimes without really always appreciating the true meaning, first principles. If we want a first principles systematic approach to this, then let's break down the barrier of what's blocking us from having the real conversation. Why is it that there are fewer Black people in this industry? Why is it that there are fewer women executives in this industry? Why is it that when you have a person who might be trans who's coming into an organization and trying to ascend to the highest heights of a cisgender white male, that it seems to be difficult for that? Like, name me one. I can name one, but try and name me more than one trans tech executive that you know. And I think once we start asking these really tough questions and having the really tough conversations, we can start, like, again, looking at first principles and going, okay, how do we approach potentially applying some remediations to this and some new systems? I don't have the answer to what that system is. If I did, I would be doing it right now. I'd have my own company and it would be great because everyone would want to come to it because it would be this diverse wonderland that's producing outsized impact. But I'm trying. And I think what I need are accomplices. I need people who want to try with me and who want to execute on really seeing a change in our industry.
Wow, that's awesome. I'd like to spend more time on this project. We got to get to our next question, but this has been fantastic so far. Shannon, so something, speaking to a little bit about sort of like that lowering the bar concept and that diversity, diversity hire, like people talk about like diversity hiring as a thing. Can you help us sort of walk through like, what's wrong with that framing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, apart from everything. So look, here's the deal. Inevitably, every time that I talk about diversity, I hear, how can we hire more diverse talent without lowering our hiring bar? And it honestly drives me crazy because there's this toxic and pervasive theme that inclusive hiring means lowering your bar. And quite frankly, we've done over 80,000 technical interviews, and I can tell you the data shows that that's just fundamentally flat out not true. Okay, our low bar candidates aren't the ones that are applying to the company website from HBCUs and coding academies. They're the ones that we're playing fantasy football with, right? And quite frankly, I have to say, and this is very passionate for me, but anybody who refers to a colleague as a diversity hire likely isn't following their company values. I mean, how did they make it past the values fit, which we talked about earlier? Why are you excusing that behavior and creating a culture where that is a question that's okay to ask? I mean, to me, that's lowering the bar. So that's what I have to say about it. I mean, we build, as everyone spoke to, and Jamil and everyone else has spoken to, we build a culture that we're hiring into. If we're seeing candidates who are rejected based on conscious or unconscious bias, it means that we've allowed an internal culture where that can happen in the first place. But again, the data is there. We've done over 80,000 of these who work with some of the top tech companies in the world. And fundamentally, we have never seen a company that has to lower the bar to hire diverse candidates.
You heard it here first, folks. So Jared, that brings me to this question. So Mecca Okereke has this concept of inclusion debt, right? And it's something that I think about a lot when hiring. Like part of not taking on more inclusion debt is being able to screen for it at the interview phase. How do you think about assessing sort of DEI fluency in an interview?
That's a great question. I think for me, it is asking those questions right off the bat and weaving those within the structure of the interview. So tell me about your current team and how it was built. Give me some feedback if you were to change the direction of your team, or what kind of feedback. If a person can't top of the mind think of those, especially if you're in the Bay Area, you're going to be able to point out some of these things like, hey, everybody looked like me. We were, a homogenous group of people, or maybe you came from a really strong background, and so you say like, I hope that my next team looks like this. And so you're looking for those key words from folks to make sure that when they come in, their expectation isn't that their group is homogenous and we all think together and we're all rock star engineers. Our expectation is that I'm gonna come in a diverse background. It's gonna be challenging. I'm gonna help everyone on my team, and my team is gonna help me. And we're all additive. We're all additive hires to the pool of engineers to solve these business problems. And if we think more along these lines, then we know that we are building a team that is going to be aligned to the business and be successful, as opposed to we're looking for a specific niche to fill on our team, and that niche was just filled for that. And so we get into those conversations about what type of hire this is, as opposed to how is this additive to our organization.
Awesome, good. So one of the things that I find really interesting is what happens when like someone does pass that technical bar but they don't pass this inclusivity bar. And that's not, I feel like for many of us, not a conversation we're used to having. That's not a decision that we're used to having to make in that context. What's something that you could sort of say to folks to help them feel or help them normalize this? And
yeah, that's one of the things that I love about my current role, is that when we interview people, we give them very candid feedback around why you didn't make it, or why you did make it. And then we also explain to the team why we're adding this person to the team, so it makes it well. And so when you say, you kind of framed it or set me up really well by saying, I have these two bars and you did really, really well in this one bar. However, I'm hiring for multiple bars, and this one, I still need more from you. And I need to give you this feedback so that the next time you come interview for us, that you will exhibit this display. Because we all know that in an interview, it's very pressure, and you might have just not displayed that aptitude at that time. And so, you fumbled or stumbled and just not said the right thing. So a lot of it is, explaining to your team and also explaining to that person and giving them that direct feedback on what your expectations are for the role.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Lori, we're talking a little bit about sort of accomplices earlier. Jamil was talking about what I think something else that that we've talked about a little bit was sort of the time commitment of an interview process and how that might be affecting your hiring processes. When you're designing an interview process, like how do you think about how much time you ask of a candidate?
Yeah, so this is a really hard one, to be perfectly honest, because there is no one size fits all, and we don't like to hear that when it comes to interviews. In our mind, consistency means that everyone goes through the same exact process. And while that may be true, it means that that process is normally a lot more approachable for certain types of people than other types of people. So we say in this industry constantly that searching for a job is a full-time job. Well, there are people who can afford to make it their full-time job, and there are people who cannot. That is a huge barrier. There are people who, if they're working, have a lot less flexibility with calling out or having synchronous calls during the working hours of their, potential employer. That's an issue. But conversely, it's okay, then we'll make everything async and take home. Then you have the problem where, someone's going to work on it for 6 hours, even though they told you they only worked on it for 2, and someone's going to get 30 minutes between, giving the baby feedings, and that's as good as it's going to get, right? So like different people's schedules are different, which is why we have all of these conversations about flexible hours and working from home, but they normally do not apply to interview processes. And it's not just the interview one engineer is creating, right? It's the entire process. So if you have one flexible interview in 7 rounds, that doesn't solve the problem. I have lots of, I could go on a whole conversation about why we have 7 rounds in the first place and where we can maybe cut some corners there and try and make this more approachable for people. But we have to be more flexible. I've seen recently some places that give you an option and say, hey, synchronous interview or a slightly different but compatible take home that we feel we can judge the same. That's a great way to diversify the pool of people who can fit into your process. But I believe we talked about this the other day, or I heard someone saying this. It's not the first. It's not, you get 5 people who qualified for the job and then you pick the best one. No, it's the first person across the finish line. And if you have to have someone who has to spread out their interviews because they can only take 2 hours off every week or whatever it is, they're not going to be the first person across that finish line. So in my mind, yes, we have to design an interview that can be done flexibly and with some period of time, but we also need to know people's constraints ahead of time, and we need to find ways to work within them rather than trying to fit them into our predetermined process. And yes, we want to get the same signifiers and we want to have the same, objective scoring model and all of those things. And it's not a simple, there's no obvious solution to this problem. But when people give us constraints, we need to attempt to find ways to work within them instead of decide that they're not the right candidate for us. Because just because they have those time constraints doesn't mean they won't work into our, if we hire them, doesn't mean they can't do a full-time job for us. It means that they can't do 2 full-time jobs right now.
Yeah. Wow. That is great. Yeah. I think what we were talking about the other day was a lot of times our interview processes, we think of it as like America's Got Talent, where you see all of the acts and then you get to pick which one you think is the best. When really it's more like you said, whoever crosses that finish line first is the way it goes. Thanks. This has been a really great conversation today. I think, my takeaways are, we have to build systems to combat the system out there. Reducing bias in the interview is just one part of a larger effort that requires constant effort that we need to keep pushing out there. So thank you all so much for these wonderful insights today. Thank you to our panelists. This has been super great. We'll be taking questions now on the Lead Dev Slack channel, on the Lead Dev Slack in the hiring channel. So please head there to continue the conversation. And thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.